Good evening, everyone. My name is Meredith Walters from Brooklyn Public Library, and I'm so delighted that you're joining us tonight for this conversation between Vishaka Desai and Mona Eltahawy. And they are discussing Vishaka's new beautiful book, The World is Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings. Ms. Desai is a senior advisor for global affairs to the president of Columbia University and a chair of the university's Committee on Global Thought. A noted scholar of Asian art, and frequent commentator on the intersection of arts and contemporary issues. She is the past president and CEO of the Asia Society. And she will be joined in what I know will be a very lively conversation tonight by Mona Eltahawy, who is a feminist author, commentator, and disruptor of the patriarchy. Her first book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, came out in 2015 and targeted patriarchy in the Middle East and North Africa. Her second book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls from 2019, took her disruption worldwide. She is the editor-in-chief and essayist for feministing.com. I'm so glad that they will be in conversation tonight, and we will have time for your questions at the end. Please welcome our guests.
Thank you, Meredith. Hello, everyone. Oh, no, okay.
You're fine.
Okay. I'm seeing different screens. Okay, thank you, Meredith. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to what I am sure is going to be a great conversation. Vishaka, it is a pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you because your book is such a wonderful memoir and the kind of memoir that I have long awaited, because as will come out in our conversation, I am from Egypt and the world has long been my family. And so I want us to share your beautiful stories of how the world became your family and how you became the wonderful person that you are. And in your words, a dancer, an art historian, a policy analyst, and a student of contemporary politics. So we're going to have, hopefully we are going to talk about each one of those brilliant things that you have done with your life. But just to begin with, let's start with the banyan tree, because I love the way that you start your memoir with this gorgeous tree, and it's a beautiful photograph at the beginning. So why did you start your memoir with the banyan tree?
Well, first of all, Mona, what a pleasure it is to actually see you and talk with you, because even in the brief moments that we have talked before online, I just know that we are kindred souls, and I'm looking forward to this conversation very, very much. So let me just start with saying that the banyan tree was something that I was just always fascinated by, but it wasn't really until I went to Auroville, which is this big spiritual center in the southern part of India, and I was on their international board, and sitting there, I just realized that how perfect a metaphor it was for the way I think of life, which is that banyan tree roots go down into the ground and branches come out, and roots and branches intertwine. They have a kind of stability, but at the same time, they allow for the outside wind to come in. It kind of feels comfortable to be in the world and yet know that you're centered. So it was that idea of being centered while being in the world that I thought was what I really think about global in that sense, which is exactly opposite of how people have actually besmirched the word global. So when I started thinking about this book, it was partly to say, why did I become so passionate about this idea? And what is it? And then I realized that it's because it was my way of saying that global is not antithetical to national and local, that the roots become branches, branches become roots. And if the base is strong and safe, you can actually be in the world in a way that you can embrace the whole world. And then COVID happens, and you realize that this very phrase, world as family, which is 3,000-year-old ancient Vedic phrase. And it's not everybody uses it in India. It's like such a cliche term in a way. I thought, oh God, I probably better not use this. And lots of my friends were saying that. And then COVID happened. I realized what a perfect word it is, because family is something we all know how to deal with the family. In a functional family, I recognize is that, in fact, you learn to be independent in the context of the unit. What is it that actually makes the family dysfunctional is when the unit and the individuals don't come together. And I realized our global family is pretty dysfunctional right now. And so we need to actually repair it, heal it, and recognize that by thinking about the family as a unit, we can all understand it. Apply it to the world, perhaps we can get there rather than making it too abstracted, you know?
No, and that's beautifully put, because I would like to start with that base, you know, where your roots were formed, because the story of your family, you know, the way that you talk about your parents and what they represent for India, and that when you were born in 1947, which was a pivotal moment in Indian history. So tell us about your parents, your papa and Ben, your mother. Who were they and what did they do for India, and how was being born into that family, that base they gave you, such a great launching pad for Vishaka in Desai?
Well, thank you. First of all, you made me 2 years older.
Oh,
But
I'm so sorry.
okay.
Oh no. Oh.
You're right, that actually, as Salman Rushdie would say, I'm almost a midnight child.
Ah, okay.
Not quite, you know.
49.
49, exactly. But the thing that's so interesting about being born literally when India was being born as a country, and to be born in a family where both my parents were big activists and in Gandhian struggle. They were from different castes. They did not get married until my mother was 31 and my father was 33, which is revolutionary, if you can imagine, in those days. And at the same time, they came to the Union with a kind of a sense that they were as much a part of building a new India as they were part of building a family. And at the same time, they recognize, and as this phrase, world as family, comes from this Vedic phrase, the phrase starts by saying that only the limited ones think of their blood relatives as their family. It is the more magnanimous ones that actually must and do recognize that the world is a family. And they took it seriously in the sense that we grew up with 7 kids, but we also had a very dear friend of my mother's who died, and her daughter came and lived with us. We had lots and lots of people who always came into the family, and they became part of this ever larger family. So we actually learned at home that family was not just about a small unit. It was not about a nuclear family. It was about creating a familial spirit and a welcoming spirit for everybody from different parts of India, different parts of the world coming in. And so I grew up in that. Also, my father was both a writer, an activist, and a romantic. I have to say, was a romantic revolutionary. And he wrote even before he was a big activist, and often he wrote in the British prison. He was in and out of jail, including solitary confinement for 6 months at a time. And he often said that this was the best education he got because he could read. When he was outside, he had to be an activist. And when he was inside, he met all kinds of different people. And he was really a revolutionary in the sense that he didn't believe in marriage as the only unit. He felt that it was very important that people recognize that. And my mother, on the other hand, came from a more traditional family, but she also left her hometown to go to Ahmedabad from Surat and was in a hostel, got involved with the women's movement. You would appreciate that. She was a true feminist in a way, but in her own context, understanding that if she was going to be a wife and a mother, and at the age of 31, if she was going to have kids, then she always said marriage was a choice, not a foregone conclusion. It was like a comma in the middle of a sentence. And it was not a full stop, not a period at the end of a sentence. And so she actually gave me that advice when I was 20 years old and fell in love with a Peace Corps worker. And they both tried to tell me, please, you don't have to get married. You know, and I talk about it in the book that actually my father said, you want to go back to the States? I had come here as an exchange student. He said, go there, live together. And my mother said, well, not really live together, you know. And he said, no, I mean, you should live together as a couple because it's two different cultures coming together and then see what happens. And I, of course, rebelled against them and said, no, I wanted to get married at home, traditional Indian style. They knew better. That marriage didn't last, can I say?
See, that's one of the reasons that I love your book, and I'm so glad you wrote it, because, you know, when I go to the memoir section of books, you know, there are memoirs by a lot of white women whose upbringing is just so foreign and alien to me. You know, I'm from Egypt, you were born in India. So when I was reading your book and, you know, and your dad said that, I was like, what? Oh my God, my dad would never have said, go and live with him before you get married. And then when you were 17 and you were offered a scholarship to go to spend a year with an American family, you know, again, I was able to put myself in your shoes and think, you know, so I was born in 1967. That's why I thought 47, because I put, you know, those 20
Right,
years,
exactly.
18 years between us. But then, you know, my parents would not have let me go at 17 to go to the US. Now, we left Egypt when I was 7, but, you know, together as a family. So, and that's what I love about your book. And this is, you know, you very firmly place yourself as a woman who was born in India. Here is my cultural context, and understand how revolutionary and how different my parents were. Now, my parents were progressive in other things, but reading about that turning point in your life when you went to the US at 17, for me, you know, remembering what life was like as a 17-year-old girl from a more traditional conservative culture, that
Right.
really hit home for me. So tell us about how that kind of really changed everything for you.
Well, you know, what's so interesting is that it was my father who actually read in the newspaper an ad. And he said, gee, this looks like something you would be good at. You should go. And they both agreed. Mind you, this is 1966, just before you were born. And I hadn't even been on a plane. I mean, in those days, you just didn't do that. You know, I had traveled all over India, but always by train. That was the way it was. And for them to actually say, we didn't know a soul. It's very hard to remember that in America, in 1966, it's 1 year after the immigration reform law had passed, so that it allowed for Asian immigration. Talk about exclusionary laws, you know, they didn't allow too many of us over there, right? Over here. And then as a result, it's very new. Only Indians who were going at the time were few Indians who were going for engineering and or medical school, but they were all men. There were not very many women. So to think about getting a woman, a young woman, not knowing a thing about America, and we also didn't have television, because this is way before we had television. So we didn't see any American programs or anything else. To actually, and I wasn't alone. There were like about maybe 40 of us or so. And there were other women. And my best friend, all the way from kindergarten to high school, and even continues to be my long-lasting friend, she also decided to go. So there were two of us, but she went to Virginia and I was sent to Santa Barbara. Pretty nice. And they had a home in Sagaponack and in the South Fork and so forth and so on. So what was the pivot? And I often say that why these exchange programs are so important is because you are thrown into another family and you live with them. You call them mom and dad, and you begin to recognize that even strangers can become family. And that is the chapter that I write about. It takes a while. It, of course, is the dislocation is there. There's no question about it. But it gives you a sense of adopting and expanding your sense of belonging, that it's possible to actually connect with a whole group of people who may have been strangers now become your family. And that, I think, was very, very important to me. And today I chair AFS, the same program I went on, which is now in 90 countries. And when I meet kids on the same program now, one of them I quote in the book where she says, this girl, that, once you open your eyes to the world, you can't close it. And that is the beauty of that kind of a program. At the same time, it was the height of Vietnam War. So I came of age understanding politics through Vietnam War, because we did the very first school-based peace vigils in California. And that was a big deal. And I was asked to speak, and recognizing that I was probably the closest to people thought they had seen anybody from that part of the world. Of course, Vietnam is pretty different from Asia and India, but I recognized that for me, it was almost like saying that if people had war, if US had war with India, they would say India war, like Vietnam war, as if it's not a culture, not a society, not a 5,000-year-old civilization, which Vietnam is. And so my little speech was to just say, Vietnam is a place, it's a country, it's people. And whether you're for it or against it, remember that there's cultures behind it. So the first thing we need to know is those cultures. And it put me on a path of looking at culture at the basis of international and intercultural understanding. And so in a way, it was my path that was created when I was, 17 years old.
Such a pivotal and incredibly powerful time and moment for you to realize that. And I especially appreciated the role of dance in your appreciation and in the ways that you combine that understanding between, or like connect the politics to the culture. Because just before you left for the US, you had a very big dance event, and you went and you continued with the dance. So how was dance that kind of bridge that helped you to cross over between art and politics and back and forth?
Right. Well, I often think of Azar Nafisi, the great Iranian American writer who I got to know a little bit. And she talked about and has written about the Republic of Imagination. And that what arts do is to open up your eyes beyond the world you live in. It also creates a different environment in which you think of yourself. And as a dancer, as a very dear friend of mine has said that, dance teaches you both discipline, but imagination. It teaches you also to be composed, but also teaches you failure. And how if something happens, you fall down, you got to get up again and you go and do that. And dance was a very important part of my life ever since I was 7 years old. And so when I went to Santa Barbara as a high school student, and I performed, and I always performed with dance and sculptures together. And then when I came back to the US in 1970 as a young bride and ended up in Cleveland, and right there at the Cleveland, in one of the Cleveland universities, I was asked to perform because somebody heard that I was a dancer. I said, sure, but I wanted to do it with the sculpture. So I just kind of made it up. And the head of education at the Cleveland Museum was there. And he said, come and talk to me. And I was kind of looking for a job, but I didn't know what I was going to do. And he said, I want you to work with young people because you're clearly a good teacher, you're a dancer, and I believe, and this is long before the whole notion of cultural representation or minorities or anything, he just believed that if the museum has collections from different parts of the world, you should have people from that part of the world to talk about that. It's kind of culture informant, culture interpreters, what have you. So he hired me on the spot, and my first job was to work with African-American kids, fifth graders from East Cleveland Public Schools, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Cleveland. And this is 1970. So it's just the aftermath of the 60s and the civil rights struggle and all of that. And I talk about it in the books. I won't read all of that. But the thing that was so amazing to me is that when they first saw me, they didn't know who I was, where I was from. And I tried to say, oh, gee, I'm Indian. And of course they said, what kind of Indian? Are you an Apache or a Navajo? And I said, gee, I'm the Indian from real India, from over there. And they said, over there, where? They didn't know where India was. And then, of course, this little girl says to me, but if Columbus made that mistake, because we went through all that, and she said, but that was a long time ago, and it was stupid then. Why do we still call them that? And this is long before people had started calling them Native Americans, right? So most people, when I first came to America, they would say, oh, you're the East Indian. The real Indians are the Indians in America. So that was kind of a bizarre thing. But once we started in front of a dancing Shiva sculpture, a beautiful Nataraj that Cleveland had, and I started having them taking poses and make gestures and dance, and we started talking about it. And 6 weeks later, they were coming to me once a week for almost a whole day. And we did India, we did China, we did Japan. All these galleries were their friends. The sculptors were their friends. They would talk to them. They would make presentations. And what I realized was the power of art. Dance, sculpture, no matter what it is that it does have this capacity to transcend space and time, to be beyond geography or particular history. And at the same time, it is a very specific product of a specific time. So today, when we talk about cultural appropriation and contestation, sometimes I feel like we forget that art doesn't want to be in a little box, whether it's writing, whether it's music, whether it is visual art, that art has that duality. And in a way, we should celebrate that duality and not just push hard, even though social justice, historical wrongs have to be done right, all of that. But we mustn't forget the power that art also has on the other side.
Absolutely. And before I ask you my next question, Vishaka, I just want to remind attendees that as selfish as I wish I were, and having you for all the questions myself, we will be opening up questions for attendees in 20 minutes or so. So if everyone can just hold on to their questions, we will get to you. Excuse me. So, talking about art and kind of moving along with your path, I was really struck when you visited the Taj Mahal during one of your visits, and you asked yourself, because you stood there and you looked at this incredible World Heritage Site, and you asked yourself, is it possible to be a true lover of art and an objective scholar? And I think that is a question, I think I'm right to say that is a question that has stayed with you for for most of your life as you've moved between different positions, and we'll get to the different positions that you move between. But I was also struck that very soon after, you were advised to go to a temple. So tell us about that, because I think that experience in the temple is so powerful and goes to the heart of that question.
Very much so. And the reason why I wanted to make sure that it was in the book is that often when we think about we're a scholar, and especially you're trained in the West and you know exactly how to do your scholarship. And when this older scholarly friend of mine and a colleague said, you must go to this temple, it's the Vishwanath temple at Varanasi, the holiest of holy cities in India. And he said to me, please don't go as an art historian, because I know your mother is a Vaishnava follower of Krishna and the Vishnu tradition. This is the Shiva temple, but it is not about that. I want you to go as a believer. And I didn't really know what he meant, because I don't know if I'm a believer or not, but I grew up in traditions, so that's fine. To go to this Vishwanath temple, which today is nothing like that, I have to say, but to actually, and he arranged for me to be at the very center of the Garbhagriha, or the womb chamber, the inside of the temple, because he knew a priest. And to hear the sound, it had no electricity, just candlelight and lamps. And then there's gongs and the conch shells, and they're chanting the Vedic chants from very early traditions. Almost felt like I was in some ancient place. And I couldn't stop crying. And I didn't know why. And then I realized that partly I had left this India. Here I was, a cultural interpreter. I was studying Indian art, but more from an objective point of view. And that had I lost something, that had I lost something of a community that was part of me. So partly to write that episode in the book is also to say that it's not all easy to continue to think about the world as family, because there are confusing moments. There are moments where you give up something and you gain something. Sometimes they fuse. And after that moment, I realized that I'm both rather than one or the other, so that I can appreciate wonderful piece of music, a wonderful piece of art, and also analyze it and also think about its historical place, but that I don't have to make choices. So in a way, it's a good metaphor to say, you don't always have to say either or. You don't have to make choices. Try to be both. It's okay.
Yeah. The both and many are like, resonate again and again throughout the book, because another quote that stayed with me, or something else that you wrote in the book that stayed with me, was when you talk about the pain and pleasure of multiple belongings. And what you just said now about leaving India and did you lose a community? I connect that with, like I said, I was born in Egypt, and my family, I've left Egypt and lived in, many times, and returned to Egypt many times. And I've lived in about 5 or 6 different countries. But I remember once going back to Egypt with a camera, because I just bought a camera and I wanted to go out and take pictures. And I realized that I was taking pictures of things that when I lived in Egypt, I never saw. But I went and I realized that what had happened is that I went back with different eyes. I was now, as an Egyptian, seeing Egypt with almost like foreign eyes, but I'm not a foreigner, I'm an Egyptian. And that's again one of the reasons I love your book, because there are very few memoirs in which I can say, yes, I see all of those different ways of seeing. And another way of putting that is code switching. And you talk about code switching in the book, in various forms. So talk to us about the ways that you have become very fluent in code switching and flexible in it throughout your life.
Well, and I'm sure that you can say 100 times just the same, right? Because all of us who have lived in these multiple worlds, we do it all the time without even knowing it. But sometimes it's confusing, and that's where the pain comes in. So in the book, I write about the times when code switching got completely confused, and that was during tsunami. And when I'm in India, I've just been appointed the president. I'm there for my 90th, my mother's 90th birthday, and this thing is happening. And my husband is calling me from the States. He's about to come, and he says, "You better pay attention as the president of the Asian Society." And I just couldn't do it. I was so in the middle of preparation for my mother's birthday and the social things around me that it took me a while to actually be able to handle that. Because for the longest time, I didn't realize this, is that when I went to Ahmedabad, not all parts of India, but Ahmedabad, I didn't want to do any work. I didn't want to be a professional. I wanted to be just where I was at home. And it took me a while to recognize that you're going to have to figure this out as to how do you do both. And those are complicated moments in some ways. Similarly, at the same time, as you said, the code switching is also about others' perception of you. It's not just what you think of yourself, but how others think of you. So my favorite thing is always when I was the president of the Asian Society, and there would be lovely people, often women, white, older, and they would say, "Oh, I just went to your country and it was so beautiful and so colorful. And why did you wear saris all the time?" And I immediately would very nicely say, "I carry an American passport." And I just had to say that, but nicely. At the same time, I realized that they didn't mean any harm, but they pegged me as one way. And I had to resist to not be pegged that way. But when younger colleagues ask me, I said, you know what? The most important thing you'll have to remember is in the best of times, you can belong anywhere. In the worst of times, you'll belong nowhere. The option of having a single belonging is what you give up when you have multiple belongings. You don't have that choice. And it's sometimes painful, but at the same time, the possibilities that open up are immense. So it's worth the pain.
Yeah, the pain and the pleasure, Vishaka. Well, let's get to the Asia Society now, because, you just mentioned being the president and the CEO of the Asia Society. But before you took on that role, you started working with Asia Society, and you brought all of those complications. And I think it's fair to say that one of your earliest and most powerful contributions was to bring contemporary art into the forefront, because there's always, and I loved how you describe how, like, Western arts, for lack of a better term, is allowed to be contemporary, but the art of us, the rest of us, it's always the old and authentic. As an Egyptian, again, I recognize that pain and the pleasure of that. So talk to us about your determination to drag contemporary Asian art and put it front and center at the Asia Society, because that was so powerful.
And it's really interesting how I came to it, because I was trained as an art historian. I studied what people studied in the Western universities, but also in India, because India has already got the colonial experience of how art would be taught. First, art history was not taught very many places in India anyway. So it's all in the West, in England and in the United States. And so initially I had bought in, I drank the Kool-Aid, to say, yes, it's in fact, the authentic Asian art is all from the past. Once the West comes in, it actually becomes all mixed up and it's not pure enough. And therefore, it's not worth looking at, because at best, it's going to be the pale reflections of the West, right? And then actually, when I was in Boston, before I came to New York, I had this kind of a feeling of uncomfortability, because I was talking to my friends in contemporary art. They were looking at other things. And there was a big collector who wanted to do something. And I said, it's not going to be possible, even though I was a curator of Indian and Southeast Asian art. And I said, it won't work because people won't take it seriously. Then I began to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this picture. And out of that emerged that I read lots of anthropologists. And it was Clifford Geertz and other people who actually were articulating how this narrative comes about. So that here are the Westerners, colonialists, who come into India or Southeast Asia or Egypt even to some extent. And then they say, this ancient stuff is great. Right now, everything is debased, which is one way of justifying the colonial presence. That the culture is debased, we are there to make it better. And then the Brits in India start the art schools, and everybody goes to art schools, and the professional art making happens. It's all completely Western. And out of that, what happens is that you kind of put pre-modern in one category with a rupture, and then you don't look at modern. And then once you don't look at the modern, you don't look at the contemporary. And so it really began to irk me that, what is this? Why are we doing this? Especially because in my own family, I had grown up with artists who came from different parts. My father had contemporary art, he had traditional stuff, he had books from different parts. So we didn't make those distinctions. So then the question was, why are we making the distinctions? What's really going on? And I had pretty much given up on museums, and I was going to go the academic route. Then Asia Society called me for the interview to be the director of the museum. And I had decided that I was just going to tell them that actually you're the right place, because you already do contemporary affairs. Asia Society is a multidisciplinary institution. So they have education, they had political affairs, they had arts and culture, and they all of these different divisions. So I said, this is a perfect place, but I may not be your person, because if you don't want to do it, I'm not coming. And I said, my degree looks like it fits you very well. I have all the traditional credits and credentials. And they hired me nonetheless. So I said, okay, I'm coming, then I'm going to do this. And at the same time, Sherman Lee, who was my mentor at the Cleveland Museum, was the head of the search committee and very distinguished Asian art scholar. And to be fair to him, he said, Vishaka, that's good, but where are the curators? How will you find them? How will you go about doing that? And I said, good question, we'll find them and we'll do it. And so it was more from this notion that why is it that when it comes to culture, we're only looking at the past, but you're looking at the politics in a contemporary setting? So is it that it's only dead art is good art? What is this, So it was very visceral for me. And then I realized that, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Now, to be fair, there were people in other parts who were doing it, but it wasn't a consistent effort. And what we decided is for a decade, we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. I started with an Asian American show and then did a big contemporary Asian show. And it's the first time, I'm proud to say, that a lot of dealers actually would say, usually dealers are the one who start something for commercial interest. It said, this was one thing that did not start with dealers. It started with a museum and institution. And I've learned a lot, partly because I realized selfishly that by doing contemporary Indian, contemporary Asian, and Asian American art, I was finding voice for myself as a contemporary being, as a person of a moment in time, and taking responsibility rather than just being a cultural informant to talk about faraway places, exotic places, and understand history. I mean, I'm still passionate about history. There's no question about that. But I do think that history without the understanding of the present context, or the present without the historical context, is limiting. And so I'm very privileged to have been able to do that. And now it's 30 years later, it's amazing. It's everywhere, and there are big names and collectors and big museums are doing it. And so it's a very heartening thing for me.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I think that we have to be able to be seen in our contemporary and modern forms is that it allows complication. And so often we as people of color are not allowed to be complicated. We're that one thing, like you were saying. And for me as a woman of color, especially, it's like I often say that one of the ways, or one of the goals of my writings, and what I always want to do, is complicate the narrative, be it of women from my part of the world or women of color generally. And I was reading your book, and I had just written an essay called Unmothering, about being child-free by choice.
Right.
And then so I'd just written this essay. It's for Feminist Giant. My newsletter is called Feminist Giant. And then I came across the passage in your book where you have this incredible conversation with your mother. And well, one of the things that I say in my essay is that most of the books and essays I read about women who are child-free by choice are written by white women. Very rarely do I see women of color, or anyone who isn't a white cisgender woman. So, trans men, non-binary people. So I'm like, I'm going to write a book about being a woman of color who's child-free by choice. And then I get to the section in your book, and your mother just has this incredible conversation with you about having children. Please tell us about how that came about, and just how that impacted your life.
It's, what's so remarkable about that is that I come from a family of 7 kids, right? And we're a very close family. And I sort of always thought I would have kids. Unlike you, I didn't think that it was by choice. And I thought, but somehow the timing wasn't right, or the person wasn't right, or whatever. And I finally meet my husband, my second husband, who it's a perfect partnership, as it were, people were saying. We thought that too. And, but I was at that point already 41, and he was 49. And he had 2 kids from previous marriage, and he was a little reluctant, and so forth and so on. And I said, I really felt like, okay, finally we can do this. Even at 41, it's possible, right? And I was talking to my mother about that. And I was so surprised what she said, because she gets married at 31, then proceeds to have 7 kids. And I often used to joke with her is that thank God you got married at 31, because otherwise you'd have a brood of 20 or something, you know, because you just produce babies and she liked having babies and whatever. And here she was, and she says to me, Nanu is my nickname in home. And she said, Nanu, not everybody's put on this earth for the same things. And that lots of people can have babies, but not a lot of people are capable or have the possibility of having a partnership where your husband is a China specialist, you're doing India, you're at the Asia Society, you're doing this work. It's important work. And so don't think that every woman, this is a foregone conclusion. And it goes back to her earlier statement saying marriage is not a foregone conclusion. And that she had decided, in fact, that if things had not worked out, she was not going to get married. And she was going to remain unmarried and give herself to the cause, which was, in this case, women's movement in India. And she also proceeded to then say that you have lots of sisters and brothers, nieces and nephews. They can be like your children. And it's okay. And it just opened up for me the possibility that you can actually, and my students are sort of like my children. No, I love teaching. I love working with them. And I am very blessed to have nephews and nieces, and, you know, we are really close in that sense. But I did not come to it by choice. And there, once in a while, there's still that sort of feeling of, I let the 30s go by without thinking about this. But she was the one who also said to me, just think about it. If this was that important to you, you would have lived your life differently, but you didn't. So own it. And that's pretty amazing too, you know.
It really is. I mean, what a gift,
Like
what a
this.
gift.
Yeah.
It's such a gift to have that kind of liberation. Your mother kind of like set you free from that. And I love that. And, you know, I was talking earlier about my parents wouldn't have let me go at 17, but my parents are very progressive when it comes to marriage and children. And when I was reading that passage between you and your mother, I remembered a conversation between my mother. So my maternal grandmother was pregnant 14 times, and 11 of those children survived. They are, you know, my maternal aunts and uncles. My mother is the eldest of those 11 children, and she has 3 children. I'm the eldest of those 3 children, and I have none. And I remember my mother once asked me, are you happy like this without children? And I said, yes, I am. And that was it. And it's such a liberation. It's a gift from our mother, you know, because you have that.
Yeah, and they're not making you guilty.
Yes.
Not having that. Yeah.
Exactly. And that conversation. So you then became the president and CEO of Asia Society. But the way that you did, and I'm so grateful that you described it this way, because we are now having a conversation in the United States, finally, about having Black women in positions of power, women of color in positions of power. So tell us about how you became the president of Asia Society, because I think it's very of the moment, even though it happened many years ago.
Yeah, exactly. What happened was that my husband was the president of the Asia Society, then he retired, and there was another president, and I was a director, and I was doing more and more and more responsibility, effectively number 2, when it was time for the other president to retire. And I had this long conversation with my husband, and he said, of course, it'll come to you. I mean, that's what happened to me. And I was already there, and he was only 38 years old, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, I don't know about that, because somehow I had completely incorporated internally that there are 3 different barriers against me. That one was that I was a woman. The other one was I was a woman of Asian origin for the Asian Society, right? Because they never had anybody but a white man. And thirdly, I came from culture rather than from the policy background. We always had either the former ambassadors or people who were out of the history of politics. That's where my husband was as well. And I thought it's just going to be too difficult for them. So you know what? It's better for me just not to think about it. But however, I waited because Richard Holbrooke then was the chair, a grand old foreign policy specialist and a power to reckon with. And he actually said, look, we are going to do an open search, but we would love for you to be a candidate. And it'll be important, but I just want you to know it's a big open search. And I said, guess what? I'm not a candidate. I withdraw. And he said, but promise me you're going to stay. And I said, I'm not promising anything of the sort. We'll see where we are. And then other trustees started calling me saying, what are you doing? Why are you not there? And I said, you know what? You go ahead and do the search, see where you are at the end. And if you still feel that you need to talk to me, I'll come and talk to you. And I didn't really think about it in a strategic way or anything. It's just sort of much more emotional. And what happened was, then as a trustee said, well, why are you doing this? And I said, I do think it's going to be hard for you to think about a woman, think about an Indian woman in an Asian context, and to come from culture. So you have to ask these questions. And they asked all the tough questions. I answered them because I was prepared for that. And they, of course, made the unanimous choice. But it was really recognizing, and I recognized that the difference between now and then is that for many of us of a certain age, we kind of preemptively accepted some things and then pushed from inside. So we were more like inside subversive rather than banging on the outside. And that perhaps is not acceptable to young people, but I do think that what worked then as a result is that they all became my partners, the trustees, staff, and they really felt that. But I write about this in the book, and lots of people have commented on that section that the first country I went to was China. After I hadn't even actually taken on the job, but I was appointed and it was announced. So I said I would go to China. And at this lunch that was hosted by a former ambassador to Paris and Germany, and very distinguished guy, and throughout the lunch, it was clear that he was trying to figure out who I was and what to do. After a couple of Mai Tai, then at the very end, he looks to me and he says, I don't know who you are. And I said, oh, please tell me, Ambassador, why? And he says, when I close my eyes, I hear an American voice. I think you're an American. Then I see your face, but you're Indian. So how can you lead an American organization and be Indian? And I don't know where it came from, but I just sort of said, in China, you really like metaphors and parables. And I think the only way to describe it, and maybe it's my obsession with the things like banyan tree, that I thought about a tree. And I said, if I were a tree, my roots would be Indian, my branches would be American, but I would be a fruit-bearing tree. So the fruit can go anywhere and belong anywhere. But this is only possible in a country like America. And he was like completely speechless. And I myself, I didn't know what to say. And then he sort of bowed and, we took off. But it is that idea of the perception of others. So that how people claim you, not claim you, think of you. And especially right now, I've been thinking a lot about the Asian American issues, that how often one of the problems with Asian American issue in this country and the racism is that they're never seen as American enough. Our skin and our face immediately defines us as the other. And the only thing that we have in common is our American experience of being perceived as the other. So in that sense, it's ironic that it isn't our Asianness, and yet it's the superficial Asianness that actually stops people from seeing us as part of this country. And at the same time, I really think the 21st century is really about and that the fact that I'm both Indian and American and Asian and American, I have at least 6 identities like everybody else, And I think it's better that way because you can feel the empathy for people beyond yourself when you have those connections that are deeply rooted in multiple locations.
Yeah. So I've got a couple more questions, Vishaka, and then we're going to open it up to
Right.
attendees. So I better make these my best last 2 questions. So about, being all those 6 different identities, I was struck by something one of the young people you work with said to you, because I think this is where now challenging the predominance of the white narrative, like American as white, or
Right.
challenging the centrality of the so-called West, where it's always about the US or it's always about Europe. One of the young people that you work with, I think it was in Asia 2.1, or was it your Columbia, perhaps your Columbia
Okay.
program,
Yeah.
the Columbia
Brazil.
program.
Brazil.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of them, it was a student in Rio, in Brazil. And he said to you something I think like is so on point, especially for this world, that we're living in now, where he said, look, we all know what American and European young people want and think. I don't care about them anymore. I want to know about what young people in China think and what young people in India think. And I think, that connected to everything you just said about, being Asian American and not being white. I mean, this is the world that, people like us have longed for. And I love the way that you talk about the young people you work with, because they seem to be the bridge towards that. So tell us about them.
I think what's so incredible, I consider it such a privilege to actually have the chance to work with young people, both at Columbia, then at AFS, and meeting them in all different parts of the world. And my perception and my experience has been that these are the true global natives. That's a Generation Z, people who were born at the turn of the century, 2000 or so, and that they really understand because of communication that the world is in their palm, that they can connect anywhere, anytime, whatever they want to do. We also know from studies that in the global north, what that has done in terms of the social media and everything else is that people create more and more cliquish behavior. In global south, in many parts, not all, but many parts, they actually use it to expand their world and where to go. So there is their thrust and a thirst to learn about places that they know are sort of important, but they don't get to know about it. And there is a hunger for it. There's also a hunger to connect across cultures. And we did this with COVID in the same Youth in a Changing World project, where we did a number of Zoom calls right after COVID happened to see how they were being affected. And what was amazing was that in a very short period of time, after talking about how that had imperiled their education and they'd stopped, they all started talking about the inequalities that they saw all around them, and that what we were going to do, and environment, their passion for environment, their passion for people who are disadvantaged. And this is borne out also by all the different global youth surveys that are being done everywhere. And what that means is that they are actually more global natives and globally aware, and they're frustrated because the system that we, the adults, have created for them is not working. And they know it. So the first thing one of them had asked also after the COVID-19 thing happened, and he said, with all the scientific advances in the world, with all the things we know we could do, why is it that we failed so miserably in actually trying to tackle this issue? And with the current situation in India, it reminds you again and again. And that's why I think the title is so pertinent and right for the moment, is that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. If you think that Indian variant is going to stay in India, guess what? It's gone to 49 countries. And it is 10 to 100 times more effective and infectious than the UK variant. And so we really have to recognize that at the same time, 85% of the vaccination in the world has gone to high income and middle income countries, and less than 15% is going to the poor countries. And yet, these things are going to show up everywhere. So it is in our interest, and rightly why 40 countries have come together to actually help India out, because it's in your own interest to do that. And young people know that. That's the thing, they really feel it in their bones.
Right. Now, before we go to questions, I want to end with kind of like the opposite of how we began, the banyan tree and the understanding, as you've said multiple times, the world as family, and, from many, many, and two men especially who are the antithesis of that, who are, of course, Trump and Modi, Trump is gone, thank goodness. But, your two of your countries were led, and one is still being led, by men who are the antithesis of that. And even with Trump gone, we still have many Americans who think that way. And even when Modi goes, there will still be many Indians who think that way. So as an Indian, I know that you're very disappointed and aghast at what Modi has done and what India has become now compared to the India you were born to. And you've seen what the United States has also, kind of deteriorated into. So all of those identities that you have, the dancer, the art historian, the student of contemporary politics, what do we do? What do we do with this closing of the global mind?
I think that, and maybe I'm sort of an eternal optimist, and I don't want to be a Pollyannish person about that, but I do think that it was Du Weiming, a great philosopher, Chinese American, who was at Harvard and then went off to China, to Beida, and is now retired, had said in the early 90s. And he said, we have to recognize that globalization and balkanization are two sides of the same coin. Meaning, we have to recognize that as the world opens up and gets smaller, and people are coming and going and living cheek by jowl from many different parts of the world, there is going to be a tendency of fear, and fear brings protection. And the protection means I want to protect my little patch of land. What happens is that what the young people realize, and with COVID, it's very clear, is that no matter how much you try, it's not going to work. So one thing that I'm saying is that I recognize that this is hard. It is not something that even our systems are set up for, because the national sovereignty is so paramount in the work we do. But I also look for the slivers of hope in different places. So the truth of the matter is that, yes, what India is going through right now, 40 countries have come together. They are actually doing it, and they're not just doing it via noblesse oblige, that we're good and you're not. As Vice President Harris said, that when America needed beds and was in trouble in March, India sent supplies. So therefore, we have to do this not because we're just friend of India. We're part of the geopolitical Quad alliances, and we're part of the global community. And I think that we have to be able to recognize that on the one hand, there is going to be a pushback. And I mean, there's so much anti-global rhetoric too, everywhere, because what Trump used to say is that to be a globalist was not to be a nationalist. And what we actually have to realize is that we have to learn to be localist, nationalist, and globalist at the same time, but make a distinction. I mean, I don't mean it in a very flimsy way. So that some things, for example, climate crisis, we may have to do things very local, like getting local food and not have the food travel, but be aware that it is for the global crisis that is upon us at the global level in climate. So part of it is to contextually understand that global is relational, global is not without roots, and we have to figure out how to connect the dots. That we have not done. We have not created that rhetoric. So people who are afraid, they feel like you're going to take something away from me, but they don't realize that every time they go to Target and they go and buy things that are cheaply made in other parts of the world, Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, it affects you.